Welcome back to History 120 for our second lecture on Reconstruction in the wake of the American Civil War. As I mentioned last time, the radical Republicans that control Congress are coming to oppose the actions of Johnson's administration, and we're having a lot of friction and conflict between the two branches of government. What happens in the wake of these frictions is the rise of what we call congressional or military reconstruction. This is a reconstruction policy that Congress will implement that is the more rigorous means of returning former rebel states to the Union of States in America. So, what does congressional reconstruction do? Congressional or radical reconstruction divides the South into 5 military districts. And this means that the military is going to occupy the South and is going to be used to enforce federal law, and especially federal law based on civil rights policy and the new constitutional amendments to come into effect. Additionally, every state is going to be required to ratify a new constitution based on the United States Constitution prior to readmittance. They're going to also have to ratify the 14th Amendment, the 13th and 14th Amendment, in order to be considered part of the United States. Now, what's interesting about that, if you actually look up the history of ratification of the amendment, the last state, and I always have students look this up. If we were lecturing this in person, I would talk about this. The 13th Amendment is ratified by Georgia on December 6, 1865. This is the 27th state to ratify it. 27 of the 36 are 3/4 of the states at that time. That certifies the 13th Amendment as being valid. The last state of the original 36 states in 1865 to ratify the 13th Amendment is Mississippi, one of the first states to secede. It was rejected December 5th, 1865 in its vote. It was the ratification was certified by the state of Mississippi on February 7th, 2013. That's right, 6 years ago, Mississippi became the last state to certify its passage of the 13th Amendment. Think about that. States are also required to ratify the 14th Amendment to the Constitution in order to be readmitted into the United States. And if we look that up real quick, I'm just trying to find this information on my own. South Carolina passed the 14th Amendment on July 9th, 1868, which is it was the last state needed to ratify it in order to bring it into effect. Following that, the last state to ratify the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment defines American citizenship. Who gets to be a citizen in this state? It used to be that there was a much looser, non-codified policy for what the process was for becoming a citizen. Generally, if you were an immigrant, you had to live in the country for a certain number of years. But children of immigrants had a shadowy place in the old policy. And what we see with the 14th Amendment is a policy set in stone of if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States, birthright citizenship. It also says that people are citizens of the United States no matter the color of their skin. Kentucky will be the last state to ratify the 14th Amendment in 1976. So just remember that. Just remember that Kentucky does not actually accept the 14th Amendment until I am 2 years old. So as far as military rule for the South goes, this is a map of the various military districts. Now, if you notice, Tennessee, a state that seceded, is not occupied by the military. They had actually been readmitted during Lincoln's lifetime under something like something very, very close to the 10% plan. Johnson oversaw the final readmittance of Tennessee. So they're the only southern state that is not occupied by the Union Army. Generally, with as we see, Virginia is a military district all of its own. A lot of that has to do with the fact that so much of the Eastern theater of the war was in Virginia. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. But by and large, it's 2 states per military district, with the exception of District Number 3. These districts are all overseen by their own commanding officers who have charge of the actions in their districts. It is their policy, their place to make sure that federal law is followed. So, I already talked a little bit about the amendments. We need to keep in mind that out of the Reconstruction era, we get 3 very important constitutional amendments because of the radical Republicans. The 13th Amendment, as I've already talked about a couple of times, is passed in 1865 during Lincoln's lifetime before his death. It is the amendment that ends slavery and involuntary servitude, with the exception of being the punishment for a crime. What's interesting here, Colorado in 2018 actually became the first state in the United States to end all forms of involuntary labor, including work done by prisoners. So essentially, Colorado is the first and only state in the Union that has actually ended slavery in all of its forms. Some have argued, some continue to argue that forcing prisoners to work in a system very much like convict leasing, but run by the state now, is slavery, and Colorado has made that illegal. For the part of the reason this was considered slavery, inmates had no options about refusing to work. They were paid. If they were paid far less than minimum wage, and they weren't actually paid in money. They were paid in privileges or a bill of credit at the inmate store. So we have now seen states take steps beyond what the 13th Amendment calls for in dealing with involuntary labor in this country. In 1868, this country passes the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment establishes citizenship and the processes for naturalizing citizens. It also ends the 3/5 clause. If you remember back to discussions of the Constitution that we've had in class, the 3/5 clause was used as a compromise when the Constitution was written, that said that essentially 60% of the enslaved population of a state would be used to figure out the population of the state as used for portioning members of the House of Representatives, as well as apportioning the votes for the electoral college. This was meant to counteract the fact that southern states had lower white populations and very, very large slave populations. They didn't want the slaves to vote. They didn't want to give constitutional rights to their slaves, but they wanted the slaves to count in a population census to give them more political power. The 14th Amendment also states that the United States government would not be held accountable for Confederate war debts because countries, England, France, private individuals in those countries, as well as other places, had lent millions of dollars to the Confederacy on the promise of the future sale of cotton to finance their war effort to destroy the United States. And the federal government used the 14th Amendment to say, we're not paying off those debts. We're not honoring those debts because those debts were done essentially by a rebellion in the attempt to create a separate sovereign country that did not succeed. That country doesn't exist. You're stuck with the bag. The 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, guarantees the right to vote for men without regard to race. This is one of the hardest ones to pass because there's a lot of people in this country, even outside of the South, who don't see African Americans as worthy of being eligible to vote. There was enough hardship trying to get the 14th Amendment to pass. So legally, on paper, African Americans after 1870, African American men, have the right to vote. We have established the framework for citizenship. We have voting rights. We have civil rights, the rights of a citizen being extended to African Americans. We have freedom, but by and large, we have freedom without liberty. To go back a little bit, Republicans in Washington ended slavery, but they extended minimal aid to African Americans. Yes, they established the Freedmen's Bureau, but essentially we took 4 million Americans, put them out of the street, out of their jobs and their houses, and said, you're free now. They have no money in their pocket. They have little to no personal private property. They don't own houses. They don't own farms. They don't have the ability to buy those farms. And so we have a very tense situation pertaining to African Americans. I mean, imagine waking up tomorrow morning. University of Sioux Falls knocks on your door. Here's your diploma. You're a college graduate. Get out. You got to leave Sioux Falls. All you have are the clothes on your back, maybe a car. You have very little cash. You have no job anymore. And you're expected to take care of yourself only with the assets you directly own in hand. It's a pretty impossible task. On top of that, we have the black codes, which were localized laws that revoked civil rights and voting rights by and large. These are the poll taxes, the literacy tests, all the mechanisms that white communities after 1870 established to prevent blacks from voting. Literacy test is being able to prove that you can read. Well, you might be saying, yeah, that's great, but what about white people that couldn't read? Well, a great example of the unfairness of literacy tests, if an illiterate white man walked up to the table to vote, the people manning the ballot station might present him with a very simple, non-complex sentence to read. And they might very well guide him on how to read it. They might say, well, this word is he, this word said, this word is this. Repeat after me. You have now read that sentence. But if there was an illiterate African American man behind them in line, he might be presented with a lengthy chapter out of the King James Bible, which isn't really even in English that people speak outside of 17th century England, and he would be told that he had to read that word for word. Here's a man with no formal education, no formal training, and if he uses, let's say he reads it, but he uses slang or he doesn't pronounce all the letters, all the words, that's going to be used against him to say that he can't read, therefore he can't vote. So Southern communities are doing everything within their power to strip African Americans of their new won rights. Also, what's going on is the rise of sharecropping, and this takes advantage of former enslaved agricultural workers across the South to essentially financially re-enslave them for generations. And I believe we'll talk about sharecropping on the next slide. So sharecropping is a means of denying liberty, especially the liberty of mobility and the liberty of working at a job you choose, not a job you're tasked with, happens across the South. And we get the rise of the Klan and other groups that terrorize African Americans by night to prevent them from living in certain areas or performing certain tasks. They burn schools, they murder people. The first Klan, and we generally see there's 3 Ku Klux Klans in American history. The only one that's important in this class is the first Ku Klux Klan, say that 5 times fast, actually has a very short time span where it exists because the Grant administration will pass legislation in the wake of his election in 1868 that will crack down on the Klan, especially with the U.S. Army and its outposts in the American South and in its military occupation, that will hunt the Klan down and help dissolve the Klan by making it impossible for Klan members to go out in public. Sharecropping is probably the most important of the actions that take place in the South following the Civil War that limit the rights of African Americans and essentially hold them in a form of slavery for the next several generations. Sharecropping is economic slavery. It is debt bondage. What do I mean by that? Well, as I said earlier, cotton and tobacco require very low labor inputs to make them profitable. In other words, if you're paying somebody a living wage to come and work on your farm to raise these crops, you're not going to make a profit with these crops because these are very incredibly intensive labor-based crops. You need to go out and cut the weeds constantly with tobacco and cotton in order to save the nutrients and moisture in the soil for these crops rather than letting weeds compete with them. You need to kill bugs on them. Tobacco in particular is prone to a certain type of caterpillar that will live on these plants and eat them, and you have to go out and pick these worms off by hand. You have to cut the top off the tobacco plant at a certain height so that the growth of the plant is channeled into the growth of the leaves rather than creating a big stem that can't be sold. So what are plantation owners going to do who used to profitably raise cotton and tobacco on their farms? What they're going to do is they're going to break their plantations up into smaller units. Very often very large scale plantations are in the thousands of acres, but even smaller plantations that are several hundred acres, what you're going to do is you're going to break this down into 25, 50, 75 acre units. It depends on the size. It could even be smaller. and you're going to build a house on each of these individual farm units, and you're going to rent these new farms out to African Americans. Essentially, what you've done is you've enclosed your farm into much smaller parcels that are going to be farmed by individual families. So instead of having gangs of slaves go out and do work in massive fields to take care of your crops, you're going to break those fields up into sizes that family units can take care of, and you're going to rent those farms to your former slaves. Plantation owners, by and large, are also going to provide credit either at stores that they own or at nearby stores. Basically, they're acting as a credit reference for their slaves, their former slaves. Credit's going to be important because, by and large, African Americans and especially African American agricultural workers don't have cash. Without cash, they don't have access to credit. Without access to credit, they can't buy the equipment necessary to farm. They can't buy seed, they can't buy fertilizer, they can't buy livestock, they can't buy plows or planters or hoes or shovels. Um, they can't purchase the items they need to run a farm. Plantation owner credit allows them access to stores. It allows them access to purchase these equipments that they need. They can purchase their inputs. But at the end of the year, when the crop is harvested and sold, sharecroppers pay a share of their crop for rent. And they're going to pay between 1/2 and 2/3 of the crop that they raise as rent for the farm that they live on towards the landowner. That leaves them between 1/2 and 1/3 of that crop to pay off all other debts to the store, as we've mentioned, as well as have cash on hand to buy food, to buy clothes, to buy books for their children to go to school. In the 19th century, you had to buy your own school books. It wasn't like going to school in elementary or high school where the school district provides your books. You actually had to purchase your own textbooks. More often than not, sharecroppers owed more money at the end of the year to the landowner and to the stores than they earned through the sale of their crop. And so what happened is the contracts that they signed to rent their farms generally require that they cannot leave that land until they have paid off all debts to the landowner. This is debt bondage. It means that you are in debt. You can't move until you have paid all your debts off to the man that you essentially work for. This also means that, let's say you end up $10 in debt at the end of year one. Your contract is extended for another year in order for you to pay off your debts. But you still need to buy fertilizer, you still need to buy seed, maybe you need to repair your plow, maybe you need shoes for your mules, your kids need clothes. You're going to go further into debt with the store and the landowner as you go into your next year of your contract. You're going to make about the same amount of money as you did the first year, so you've gone even deeper in debt. And very often, these rental contracts are written in such a way that if you are too old or if you die, your children inherit your debt. And so what we see essentially is the creation of a new system of slavery based on debt slavery that extends generation to generation. The only thing that ends sharecropping will be Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal programs for the agricultural community in 1932 and 1933. But that's for another class. All right, when I come back, we'll wrap up Reconstruction. We'll talk about how Reconstruction comes to an end, and we'll talk about the legacy of Reconstruction in American history. Thanks for your attention.